You've been lied to about money. It is not moved by effort, urgency, or struggle. It is moved by identity. And the one who needs money has already declared they do not have it. There is a quiet belief operating beneath most conversations about money, and it is rarely questioned because it feels so natural. The idea that need activates supply. From an early age, we are conditioned to assume that urgency is productive, that pressure creates movement, that wanting something badly enough somehow summons it closer. Yet if you observe your own experience honestly, you will notice a subtle contradiction. Moments of financial strain are often followed not by stability, but by more reasons to strain. The harder the grasping becomes, the more elusive the sense of relief feels. This is not because money is cruel or life is unfair, but because need itself is a state of consciousness, and every state carries its own echo. What you call needing money is not a temporary emotion. It is a position you are standing in, and life responds to positions, not pleas. This is where the teaching of Neville Goddard cuts directly against conventional logic. Neville never suggested that consciousness externalizes desire, hope, or longing. He was precise. Consciousness externalizes being. What you are, not what you ask for, is what appears as experience. To want money implies that you are someone who does not have it. To need money implies that lack is your current identity. And life, acting as an impersonal mirror, reflects that identity back to you with astonishing fidelity. Like standing before a mirror and asking your reflection to smile first, the request misunderstands the mechanism. The mirror does not initiate, it responds. Reality does not change so that you may feel different. You feel different, and reality rearranges itself to match. When Neville compared life to a mirror, he was not offering poetry for comfort. He was describing a law. A mirror does not argue with you, correct you, or reward your effort. It simply shows you the image you present to it. If you approach money from the standpoint of problem solving, you are presenting the image of someone for whom money is a problem. If you approach it with urgency, you are presenting the image of someone perpetually just short of enough. The mirror does not evaluate the fairness of this image, it reproduces it. This is why so many people experience brief financial gains that dissolve just as quickly. The outer event shifts temporarily, but the inner position remains unchanged. The reflection cannot stabilize until the stance does. It is crucial then to see that need is not merely an emotion passing through you. Emotions fluctuate, identities persist. Need is an assumption about who you are in relation to money. The one who lacks, the one who waits, the one who hopes circumstances will improve. And assumptions, whether conscious or unconscious, function as commands. They set the tone of what feels natural, expected, and believable. This is why effort alone cannot resolve financial instability. You can work tirelessly and still feel behind, because the inner narrative has not moved. You are still occupying the state of the one who must struggle to arrive somewhere else. Long before Neville articulated this in his lectures, Wallace D. Wattles pointed to the same principle from another angle. He observed that wealth follows a certain state of thinking, not moral virtue, not physical strain, and not frantic activity. This does not mean action is irrelevant. It means action takes its meaning from the state that generates it. Action born of need reinforces need. Action born of naturalness reinforces possession. The difference is subtle, but decisive. One feels heavy and tense, the other feels ordinary and unremarkable. And here lies the promise of this discussion. There is an assumption so quiet, so uncharged, that when you occupy it, money ceases to feel like a goal and begins to feel like a normal condition of life. Discovering that assumption does not require force, belief, or optimism. It requires a willingness to stop arguing with the mirror and instead notice what you have been standing as all along. Need is not motivation. It's an assumption. At first glance, need appears useful. It feels like fuel, like the pressure that forces movement, the discomfort that pushes change into existence. Society reinforces this idea constantly, praising hunger, glorifying struggle, and framing lack as the necessary starting point of achievement. Yet this interpretation confuses motion with direction. Need can certainly create activity, but activity alone does not determine outcome. What matters is the state from which that activity arises. When need is present, it quietly defines who you believe yourself to be. You're no longer acting as someone who has options. You are reacting as someone who must escape a condition. And this difference, though subtle, determines what reality is allowed to mirror back to you. Need is not simply the feeling of wanting more money. It is an assumption embedded beneath thought, a silent statement about identity. It says, I am the one who does not have. And every decision, reaction, and effort that follows is filtered through that lens. This is why need feels urgent and restless. It is not trying to create wealth. It is trying to resolve an internal contradiction. The mind believes it is incomplete, and everything it does is an attempt to close that gap. But the gap itself is conceptual. It exists only because it has been assumed. As long as that assumption remains unexamined, no amount of movement can dissolve it. Consider the analogy of the door labeled locked. A person who assumes the door is locked does not test the handle. They brace themselves and push harder. They apply effort where curiosity would have resolved the problem instantly. In the same way, the one who assumes money is absent applies pressure, strategy, and strain without ever questioning the premise that created the struggle. The effort feels justified because the assumption goes unnoticed. And because it goes unnoticed, it becomes self-validating. The harder one pushes, the more real the resistance appears. The door must be locked after all, because pushing is difficult. Yet difficulty here is not evidence of truth. It is evidence of misidentification. When need is mistaken for motivation, it becomes protected. It feels dangerous to release it, as though letting go of urgency would lead to stagnation or irresponsibility. But this fear misunderstands how states operate. Motivation that arises from wholeness looks different from motivation born of lack. One is tense and impatient, the other is calm and precise. One reacts, the other selects. The individual who no longer defines themselves as lacking does not become passive, they become accurate. Their actions are fewer, but they carry weight because they are not compensating for an imagined deficiency. This is the quiet pivot that must be recognized. If need is an identity rather than a temporary emotion, then effort itself must be re-examined. Effort ceases to be proof of commitment and begins to reveal information about the state behind it. Strain points to doubt, tension points to disbelief, urgency points to separation. None of these are moral failures, they are signals. And when they are seen clearly without judgment, the entire approach to money begins to shift. The question is no longer how to try harder, but who is the one trying. From there, a deeper understanding unfolds naturally, because effort can only be understood correctly once the identity producing it is brought into view. Effort feels reasonable because it aligns with how the mind has been trained to interpret causation. If something is missing, the conclusion seems obvious. Apply more force. Work longer hours, think harder, push through resistance, and eventually the gap should close. This logic appears sound on the surface, yet it quietly assumes that absence is the starting point and that strain is the bridge. What is rarely questioned is whether the strain itself is confirming the very absence it is trying to resolve. Effort, when driven by need, does not move you toward possession. It keeps you oriented around not having, and orientation is what reality responds to first. There is a simple bodily truth that reveals this more clearly than any abstract explanation. You do not tense your hand to hold something you already believe is yours. Tension only appears when ownership is uncertain. When doubt enters, the muscles tighten, the grip becomes forced, and the body compensates for a lack of confidence. The same principle operates at the level of consciousness. When money feels distant, effort increases. Plans multiply, strategies pile up, and urgency becomes normalized. Yet all of this activity is not evidence of progress. It is evidence of disbelief. The system is overcorrecting for an assumption that has not been questioned. This is why effort often produces delay instead of acceleration. The more you try to force an outcome, the more you reinforce the story that the outcome is not already secured. Time begins to stretch, not because reality is slow, but because the inner position is oriented toward waiting. Waiting feels active when it is filled with effort, but it is still waiting. It is still the stance of someone who expects fulfillment to arrive later, and later is not a moment on a clock. It is a state of consciousness that perpetuates itself as long as it is occupied. The mind often defends this pattern by introducing ideas of deservingness. If effort alone does not seem to work, then perhaps more virtue is required. More patience, more gratitude, more moral correctness. This turns money into a reward system, as though it were evaluating character before responding. But this, too, is an extension of the same misunderstanding. It keeps attention focused on what must be added, corrected, or improved before abundance can appear. The assumption of insufficiency simply changes costume. Instead of "I don't have enough money," it becomes "I'm not enough yet." The structure remains intact. When effort is seen clearly, its role shifts. It stops being a tool for overcoming lack and becomes an expression of alignment. Effort that arises from certainty does not feel heavy or urgent. It feels almost incidental, as though it is happening on its own. This kind of movement does not argue with time, because it is not trying to outrun an internal doubt. It flows because it is not compensating, and this realization naturally exposes why strategies built on morality, worthiness, or self-improvement fail to produce consistent financial stability. They are still negotiating with absence. To move beyond this loop, the entire idea of money as a reward must dissolve, revealing a more impersonal principle at work, one that does not pause to evaluate effort at all. Money does not respond to worthiness. At a deeper level, much of the confusion around money comes from an unspoken belief that it operates like a judge. This belief is rarely stated outright, but it reveals itself in subtle ways, in the hope that being good will be rewarded, in the fear that mistakes will be punished, and in the quiet question of whether one truly deserves more. When finances fluctuate, the mind instinctively searches for moral explanations, as though money were a conscious agent keeping score. Yet this framework collapses under careful observation. Money does not respond to character, intention, or virtue. It responds to position, and position, in this context, refers to the state of consciousness habitually occupied. The analogy of gravity exposes this clearly. Gravity does not pause to assess whether a person is kind, disciplined, or hard-working before it functions. It operates automatically, responding only to placement and mass. To argue with it, to plead with it, or to try to earn its cooperation would be absurd. Money operates with the same impersonality. It does not ask who is worthy, it reflects who is being. When this is misunderstood, people attempt to negotiate with an impersonal law using emotional currency, hoping sincerity will compensate for misalignment. But laws do not negotiate, they execute. This is why stories of moral fairness around wealth are so inconsistent in lived experience. Some generous, diligent individuals struggle financially, while others with no apparent virtue experience ease and abundance. These observations are often dismissed or rationalized because they threaten the comforting idea that life is a reward system. Yet what they actually reveal is something far more precise. Circumstances do not arise to validate moral narratives, they arise to express states. When the state is one of natural possession, money flows without drama. When the state is one of separation, money becomes unstable regardless of effort or intention. Emotional reactions to money intensify this misunderstanding. Guilt over wanting more, fear of having too much, or pride in earning through struggle all load the subject with meaning it does not carry on its own. These emotions feel justified because they are familiar, but familiarity does not equal accuracy. Emotional charge creates noise, and noise distorts perception. The more charged the subject becomes, the harder it is to see the underlying mechanism at work. Money begins to feel personal, as though it were responding to moods, hopes, or fears. In reality, those moods are simply revealing the state being occupied. Once the idea of worthiness dissolves, a profound shift begins. Responsibility replaces self-judgment. Instead of asking whether one deserves money, the attention naturally turns to the quality of consciousness being lived from. This is not a moral inquiry. It is an observational one, and it leads directly to the next realization. If money is impersonal and law-driven, then emotional intensity around it is not fuel, but friction. The more charged the relationship becomes, the more resistance is introduced. To understand how that resistance operates, one must look closely at emotion itself and the role neutrality plays in restoring power. Emotional charge is the sound of resistance. Emotion feels like engagement. It feels alive, sincere, and involved, which is why it is often mistaken for power. When money is the subject, emotional intensity is frequently celebrated as passion or commitment, as though caring deeply were the same as being aligned. Yet emotion, especially when charged, is not evidence of authority. It is evidence of friction. The stronger the emotional reaction, the clearer the signal that consciousness is pushing against what it assumes to be absent. This pushing does not move reality. It broadcasts resistance. Resistance does not announce itself as opposition. It disguises itself as concern, excitement, anxiety, or even hope. All of these share a common feature. They are reactions to a perceived lack. They arise because something is believed to be missing or uncertain. When money feels neutral, there is no emotional spike. It occupies the same psychological space as your name or your ability to breathe. It simply is. This neutrality is not indifference, it is stability. And stability is what allows a state to reproduce itself consistently. The thermostat analogy captures this distinction precisely. A thermostat does not plead with the room, argue with the temperature, or emotionally react to the heat. It sets a level and remains unmoved by fluctuations. The room adjusts because the reference point is steady. In the same way, consciousness that is emotionally charged about money is constantly adjusting itself in response to outer conditions. Consciousness that is neutral holds its position. One reacts, the other regulates. And regulation, not reaction, is what shapes outcomes. Emotional charge often feels justified because it is linked to survival narratives. Money is associated with safety, freedom, and identity, so reactions seem natural. But natural does not mean accurate. The more emotion is poured into the subject, the more attention is fixed on the idea that something is unresolved. Emotion keeps the story alive. It reinforces the sense that money is an ongoing issue rather than a settled condition. This is why emotional highs and lows around finances often lead to cycles of gain and loss. The state never stabilizes long enough to sustain a new pattern. When neutrality emerges, it is often mistaken for detachment or apathy. In truth, neutrality is authority without noise. It is the absence of internal argument. From this position, money no longer feels like something to be chased, fixed, or justified. It becomes a background fact, not a foreground concern. And it is precisely this quietness that reveals the hidden assumption operating beneath all financial experiences. Once emotion subsides, what remains is not emptiness, but identity. That identity, subtle and unquestioned, determines what feels normal, expected, and inevitable. To see it clearly is to arrive at the assumption that changes everything. Beneath effort, beneath emotion, and beneath every strategy lies an assumption so quiet that it often goes unnoticed. It does not announce itself with excitement or urgency, and it carries no dramatic charge. It simply operates as a background truth, what feels normal to you. Normality is not what you desire. It is what you expect without thinking. It is the psychological ground you stand on, the baseline from which reactions occur. And this is why the most powerful assumption around money is not, "I will be wealthy," or "money is coming," but something far subtler. It is the assumption that money is ordinary for you. Consider how you relate to your own name. You do not celebrate it each morning or feel grateful that it still works. You do not question whether it belongs to you or wonder if you deserve it. When someone calls it, you respond automatically. There is no emotional charge because there is no doubt. Ownership is so complete that it disappears from awareness. Wealth, when it is truly assumed, occupies the same psychological space. It does not excite the nervous system because it does not threaten identity. It fits, and what fits does not demand attention. This is where many people become confused. They believe that feeling excitement, relief, or gratitude in advance is the key to manifestation. But these emotions often signal transition, not possession. They arise when something feels new or unfamiliar. Normality, by contrast, is quiet. It does not announce itself because it has nothing to prove. When money is normal for you, thoughts about it lose their intensity. Decisions involving it feel straightforward. There is no internal debate, no sense of stretching beyond yourself. Life reorganizes around this assumption, not because you are trying to change reality, but because reality reflects what you are already standing in. The hidden nature of this assumption is precisely what makes it powerful. You cannot fake normality, and you cannot force it through repetition alone. It emerges when identity shifts, when you no longer see yourself as someone approaching wealth, but as someone for whom wealth is simply part of the environment. Behavior adjusts without effort. Opportunities appear unremarkable. Movement happens without anticipation. The mind stops checking for proof because it no longer needs reassurance. Once this sense of normalcy settles in, a natural question arises. If money is assumed as ordinary, how does the outer world rearrange itself to match? How do circumstances shift without strain, planning, or control? The answer requires a deeper understanding of how reality forms itself around consciousness. It requires releasing the idea that you are constructing outcomes through force and recognizing instead that something far simpler is occurring. Creation is not a process of building from scratch, it is a process of selection. And understanding this reframes everything that follows. Creation is finished. You are selecting, not building. The idea that creation is finished runs counter to the way the mind has been trained to understand progress. We are taught to believe that outcomes are constructed over time, assembled piece by piece through effort, planning, and persistence. Within that framework, money must be made, grown, or chased into existence. Yet this view quietly places consciousness in a position of labor rather than authority. It assumes that something is missing from reality and that you are responsible for producing it. The deeper perspective reveals something far more subtle and far less exhausting. Nothing is being built. Everything already exists as a potential state, and what you experience is determined by which state you are occupying. This is why the analogy of selecting a channel is so precise. When you turn on a television and choose a channel, you do not create the program. You do not negotiate with it, earn it, or assemble it scene by scene. The broadcast was already there, complete and uninterrupted. Your action simply revealed it. In the same way, every version of financial experience exists as a finished pattern. Wealth, scarcity, ease, instability, overflow, and struggle are not outcomes waiting to be manufactured. They are states waiting to be selected. Consciousness is the selector, not the builder. When this is misunderstood, effort becomes misdirected. People attempt to force reality to change while remaining internally tuned to the same state. They switch tactics, environments, and routines, but the underlying frequency stays the same. The result is familiar. Different circumstances that feel strangely similar. New jobs carry the same pressure. New opportunities reproduce the same anxiety. This repetition is not punishment or failure. It is consistency. Consciousness remains loyal to itself. It continues to select the same state because that state feels familiar, even if it is uncomfortable. Selection operates through identification. Whatever you identify as, you tune into. Whatever feels like me becomes the channel you are locked onto. This is why affirmations or visualizations that conflict with identity feel strained. They are attempts to select a channel without releasing attachment to the current one. True selection happens when the sense of self shifts quietly, without drama. When you stop seeing yourself as someone trying to arrive somewhere and begin experiencing yourself as someone already positioned there, the channel changes naturally. The broadcast follows automatically. Time behaves differently once this is understood. Selection does not require waiting because waiting belongs to the idea of construction. If something must be built, then time is necessary. If something is selected, time becomes incidental. Movement still occurs, but it no longer feels like delay. Events unfold in sequence, but the sequence is no longer interpreted as proof of distance. It is simply the mechanism through which the selected state expresses itself in form. This recognition brings attention to an important refinement. While selection is always happening, it does not occur equally clearly in every state of awareness. Some states are cluttered with resistance, analysis, and emotional noise. Others are quiet enough to allow identity to shift without interference. There is one particular state in which selection becomes almost effortless because the old identity loosens its grip and the new one is impressed without argument. Understanding that state brings the discussion naturally to the next phase, where need loses its voice and assumption speaks last. There is a state of awareness in which the habits of effort, urgency, and identity loosen their grip without resistance. It is not forced, and it is not achieved through discipline. It arrives naturally as the mind releases its hold on the surface world and drifts toward rest. In this threshold between wakefulness and sleep, the structures that normally defend the old identity grow quiet. The analytical mind recedes, emotional charge softens, and the constant monitoring of circumstances fades into the background. What remains is a receptive awareness, one that no longer argues for what is missing. In this state, need cannot sustain itself. Need requires tension to exist. It feeds on alertness, comparison, and the sense of time stretching forward. As consciousness moves towards sleep, these supports fall away. Urgency loses its voice because there is nothing left to push against. The body relaxes, the future dissolves into a soft blur, and the identity that usually insists on control becomes passive. This is why impressions made here feel different. They do not compete with doubt, because doubt is no longer active. Identity speaks last, and whatever identity speaks in this state leaves a deep and quiet imprint. Sats is not powerful because it is dramatic or mystical. Its power lies in its neutrality. In this condition, the mind does not evaluate whether something is reasonable, deserved, or likely. It simply accepts impressions as experiences. When wealth is felt here not as excitement, but as familiarity, it bypasses the habitual defenses that normally reject it. There is no effort to convince, no attempt to force belief. The assumption enters gently, the way a thought enters a dream, unquestioned and complete. This is why changes that are impressed in this state feel inevitable afterward. They do not feel hoped for or anticipated. They feel remembered. The conscious mind may later search for reasons or strategies, but the direction has already been set. Identity has been adjusted at a level deeper than thought. From that point on, behavior, perception, and reaction begin to align without conscious planning. Life appears to move you rather than the other way around. What is crucial to understand is that nothing is being pushed into motion here. There is no command issued to the world, no attempt to manipulate events. The only movement that occurs is internal, and even that movement is minimal. It is a settling rather than a striving. Once the assumption has been impressed in this quiet way, the mechanics of expression no longer require supervision. Reality takes over the details because it always has. The outer sequence does not need guidance once the inner position has been set. From this point, events begin to arrange themselves in ways that often feel coincidental or natural. There is no dramatic turning point to announce the shift. Opportunities appear without fanfare. Conversations lead somewhere without being steered. Decisions seem to make themselves. This unfolding is not random, nor is it guided by conscious effort. It is the automatic response of life to a state that has already been accepted. Understanding this brings clarity to what follows next, because once the assumption is in place, the path it takes to express itself no longer belongs to personal will. It belongs to a principle that moves impersonally, efficiently, and without hesitation. Once an assumption is accepted as identity, the unfolding of events no longer requires supervision. The mind often wants to remain involved, to monitor progress or influence direction, but this impulse belongs to the old state that believed control was necessary. The bridge of incidents does not respond to management. It responds to momentum, and momentum is already contained within the state that has been assumed. Like dominoes set in place, the sequence begins the moment the first movement occurs. No instruction is needed for what follows. Events arrange themselves with a precision that feels impersonal yet exact. Conversations happen naturally. Decisions are made without your prompting. Opportunities appear without being sought. This is not coincidence, nor is it reward. It is coherence. Reality is aligning itself with a position that no longer contradicts itself internally. When identity is stable, there is no urgency to interpret signs or measure progress. The absence of seeking is the signal. The bridge unfolds quietly because it has already been decided. Stop seeking money as a solution. At the end of this exploration, the central insight becomes unmistakably clear. Money has never been responding to effort, emotion, or urgency. It has been responding to identity. As taught by Neville Goddard, the world faithfully mirrors the state you occupy, not the problem you attempt to solve. Seeking money keeps attention anchored to the version of self who believes something is missing, and that belief quietly recreates itself as experience. This is the paradox that often goes unnoticed. The more money is treated as a solution, the more it confirms the identity of the one who lacks it. Circumstances, as James Allen observed, crystallize from the states habitually lived in, not from fleeting intentions. When urgency falls away, authority remains. Neutrality is not indifference. It is stability, and in that stability, money no longer needs to be pursued. It simply knows where to go.